last Wednesday night, we covered Ezra and Nehemiah. And as you know, those two books cover the events that took place when the remnant of Judah returned to Israel, and they rebuilt the temple under the leadership of Zerubbabel. They restored the walls around Jerusalem under the leadership of Nehemiah, and Ezra the priest helped to restore their system of faith. And so all of that took place with this remnant of roughly 50,000, maybe more, maybe a little less, that returned from the captivity to Jerusalem. Now, tonight, we shift just a little, and we begin to look at those from the nation of Judah who actually stayed. Historians believe that there were actually more who stayed in Persia. You remember what used to be Babylon was conquered by the Persians, and the Persian king gave them permission to return, and many did. That's what's covered in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But the book of Esther deals with a life of a person who actually stayed in this area that is called Susa. It's the capital of Persia, and it's mentioned not only in Ezra 1:2, it's mentioned in Nehemiah 1:1, which is where Nehemiah was living when he departed for Jerusalem. But Esther and many like her stayed in Susa, and we believe there were actually many more who stayed than returned. Now, as we focus in on the life of Esther, it's important for us to remember that the theme to all of this, this book, is really God's providential care for his people. And so as we begin with going into this, it's important that we know some of the players. It's important that we know some of the people that are involved in all of this. And one of them is King Xerxes. King Xerxes, of course, is the Persian king. He was the most powerful man of his day. He ruled over 127 provinces that stretched all the way from India to Ethiopia. And if you look at your world map, you'll see that's a huge swath of land. And he ruled roughly from 485 to 465 BC. In some writings, you will run across the name Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is Xerxes. Ahasuerus is the Greek form of his Persian name. So we begin with King Xerxes. He's on the throne, and Queen Vashti is his wife. Now, interestingly enough, the name Vashti means beautiful woman. And there in chapter 1 of Esther, we read that in the 3rd year of his reign, Xerxes gave a banquet for all of his nobles and his officials. And they feasted and partied, and Xerxes showed off for 180 days. He wanted to impress everyone and maybe intimidate everyone. And so he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and all the good stuff that he had accumulated. And when the 180 days was over, he gave a banquet that lasted another week beyond that. And by the king's order, the scripture says, by the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions. So you pretty much know what's going to happen. You've got the king of Persia throwing this huge banquet, and the liquor is flowing, and there are no limits as to what each individual is allowed to consume. And so after a relatively brief time, it turned into a rather drunken affair. And in the meantime, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for all of the women in the royal palace. And so that's the setting. On the 7th day of this week-long drunken banquet. The scripture says King Xerxes himself was drunk, and he commanded his servants to bring in Queen Vashti. He wanted her decked out in her royal crown. He wanted her to be wearing her beautiful robes because he wanted to put her on display in front of all the men in this room. And there may have been hundreds of them, who knows. He wanted her to be on display in front of all the nobles. But Queen Vashti didn't buy it. She refused to come. Excuse me. And so the king became extremely angry with his wife, with Queen Vashti. And so he calls in his advisors, his wise men. And he said to them, because he was so angry and he was a whole lot drunk, he said, "What must be done now to Queen Vashti, because she has refused the king's order?" They replied to her, "Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but against all the nobles and all the people. For her conduct is going to become known to all the women. Therefore, let the king issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which means it cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than her." So you've got this whole throne room full of all these drunken nobles, and the queen has the audacity to refuse to be put on display in front of all of them. And the king becomes angry, and over the course of what reads like just a very short time, he kicks her out. And it says that's it. She's not only out of the palace, she's banished from the kingdom. She is never to come into his sight again. It's like the ultimate ancient Old Testament divorce, and she's gone. So the king must have a queen. And so when the king's edict was proclaimed throughout all of his realm, remember 127 provinces, this whole huge area of land, he included a little addition to his proclamation. He said, "All the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest." And he sent this dispatch throughout the whole kingdom, proclaiming, the scripture says in chapter 1, verse 22, that every man should be ruler over his own household. And I'm not even going to ask for comments from our ladies about how that must have made Queen Vashti and all of the other women in Persia feel. But that is what took place. And one of the things that I love about Scripture is that it does not eliminate the ugly stories. It includes details like this, I believe, more as cautionary tales, but it leaves them in. And so that's what took place. So the king's personal attendants, we're into chapter 2 now, said, "We need to search for all the beautiful women for the king." In their words, all the beautiful young virgins. Bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at Susa, and let them be pampered, and let's give them all beauty treatments. They all get makeovers, okay? Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And so basically they're advising Queen Xerxes to have a kingdom-wide beauty contest. Okay, put a marker there, and let's get a little background, because there's a meanwhile slipped into chapter 2 from verses 5 through verses 7. We meet Mordecai. This man Mordecai is a Jew. He's Esther's uncle. and he was of the tribe of Benjamin, and he was a little older. He was among those who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. And so he had lived during the days of the Babylonian captivity. And then when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, he was still in captivity, but he is living there in Susa. And his cousin, whose Hebrew name was Hadassah, Esther, that's his cousin. And he had brought her up because she had neither father nor mother. So during the course of all this stuff, I think I said earlier Esther was his niece. That's not correct. She's his cousin. And they're living in this captivity in Persia. And over the course of time, we don't know if it was natural causes or if they were killed when the Babylonians carried all the people in Judah away. But Esther was an orphan, and her cousin Mordecai comes on the scene, and he takes care of her. He's significantly older than her, and so he watches over her, and he advised her not to reveal her nationality or her family background. In other words, don't tell them you are a Jew, because she is beginning to get an open door into the palace. And so he says, let's just not tell them that you're from these captives. So we have this beauty contest. All the young women were brought into Susa, and Esther was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. And Esther pleased him. He liked her. She was apparently a very nice young lady, and he provided her with beauty treatments and special food, and he assigned her 7 female attendants and moved her to the best room in the harem. So she gained the favor of Haggai, and it paid off, because she has not yet revealed her nationality. But here's how this beauty contest is going in verses 8 through 17. When a young woman's turn came, she went before King Xerxes. He was apparently the only judge of the contest. And she had to, this was after she had completed all the makeover. And all of this process took as long as a year. And over the course of time, and all these young women parading in front of Xerxes, Esther won his favor. He was attracted to her, it says, more than any of the other women, and so he put the crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, again, we're not vouching for the propriety of all this. We're not saying it's good or right. This is just what happened. Okay, so Esther has now been elevated. She's moved into the palace. She's the Queen Esther now. Meanwhile, verse 21 of chapter 2, Mordecai uncovers an assassination plot. Now here, my friends, I think is where we can see the providential hand of God, putting Mordecai in the right place to involve him in this situation so that he can not only help King Xerxes, but so that he can gain the favor of the king. So he is sitting at the king's gate, which was his practice, and 2 of the king's officers, Bigthana and Teresh, guarded the doorway. And for whatever reason, they became angry, and they began to hatch a plot to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about it, and he told his cousin, Queen Esther. She reported it to the king and gave credit to Mordecai. That little nugget is important. She gave credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, Bigthana and Teresh were arrested and impaled on poles. So they were executed. Now, enter Haman. Haman is the villain of this whole narrative. It begins there in chapter 3. Haman is a man who desperately wants to gain power, and he wants prestige, and he wants the praise of all the people around him. And King Xerxes, for whatever reason, elevated Haman and gave him a seat higher than all the other nobles. And so he's got a little more power and a little more authority. And because of that, all the royal officials at the king's gate, remember that's where Mordecai hangs out, all the royal officials would bow down and pay honor to Haman whenever he came by. But Mordecai would not bow. And this ticked Haman off. Oh, it just boiled his potatoes. And when he saw Mordecai would not pay him honor, he was enraged. Then he learned Mordecai was a Jew. These people that the Persians had inherited from the Babylonians and who were captives and conquered in the first place. And then he began to look for a way to not only get rid of Mordecai, but to purge all of his people as well throughout the whole kingdom. So we have the potential here of mass genocide on the Jewish nation, all because the egotistical Haman is ticked off that Mordecai will not bow down to him. So Haman, because he's been elevated above all the other nobles, I'm now in chapter 3, verse 8. Haman said to King Xerxes, see, he has the king's ear now. He gets to go to court, and he gets to get up close to the king. And the king asks him to tell him what he wants. And Haman said to Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the provinces of your kingdom. They keep themselves separate. They don't fit in with us. Their customs are different from all the other people, and they don't obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to put up with them. So I advise the king to issue a decree to destroy them. And so the king took the signet ring from his finger and he gave it to Haman. That signet ring was a symbol of the king's authority, so that Haman, when he's wearing that ring, he is speaking for the king, and all of the people would take it as such. So once he got that signet ring and King Xerxes said to him, do as you please, he got busy. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces with an order to annihilate the Jewish people, all of them, young, old, women, children, on a single day that was yet to be determined. So basically, he sends out this letter to everyone, and he says, on a day that I'm going to announce, we are going to eliminate all of the Jewish people. And a copy of the edict was to be issued as law and made known to the people of every nationality so they could be ready for that day. Now, when Mordecai found out about this, of course, he's obviously upset. This is his whole nation. This is his family and everybody that he knows, all of his friends, everyone. And in the Jewish tradition, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth, that's the garment, and ashes. And he went around the city wailing and weeping, yelling bitterly. And in every province to which the edict and order of the king went, there was great mourning among the Jews. They began to fast, and they wept, and they wailed, and they cried out to God. They put on the sackcloth. They put on the ashes. The Jewish nation, especially in that day, was very demonstrative with their grief. They let it be known that they were dealing with a great amount of stress and grief and all the terrible things. Now, Mordecai went to Esther. And when Esther's attendants, well, actually, he didn't go to her right away. When her attendants found out about him, because he was making a scene, and maybe he knew it. He was going around with this big demonstration of his grief. And when word got back to Esther, she was very concerned about her cousin. And so she went to talk to him. And he told her what was going on and gave her a copy of the edict. And he told her to go to the king, to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead for him on behalf of her people. Remember, King Xerxes does not know that Queen Esther is a Jew, and technically she's included in this death warrant. And so she instructed her attendant to tell Mordecai, this is a big ask, because everybody knows that all the king's officials and all the people who want to approach the king, they come into the inner court and then they have to wait there. And if they have not been summoned, they'll be put to death unless the king extends his gold scepter. So you didn't just show up at the palace without an appointment. If the king summoned you, that was one thing. But if you went to the palace without an invitation, even if you're the queen, and the king does not extend his scepter welcoming you, you will be executed. And so then Mordecai sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Now notice something. And I want to get your reactions to this. When we're dealing with Mordecai and he's got sackcloth and ashes on his head and he's weeping and wailing and crying out and doing all this big public demonstration of his grief, he has not lost faith. Did you catch that? Even though he's scared, even though he is intensely sad, he has not lost faith, because he told Esther if she didn't help, God would simply help his people in another way. Mordecai still believes that the Jewish people are going to be protected by their God. So there is a possibility of being intensely sad, grieving, even angry, and still maintaining faith. It's not easy to maintain faith. Some of you, and I have as well, have dealt with intense grief and terrible setbacks in life and things that caught us completely off guard. And yet, it is possible in those times to maintain faith. I love the quote that Tracy reminded us of, the thing that Mordecai told Esther, who knows that you were not born for such a time as this. This may be your moment. And so, this is important. So what does Esther do? She sent back word to Mordecai and she said, I want you to gather all the Jewish people and get all the people that are here in Susa and fast for 3 days, no eating, no drinking, and I want you to pray and fast, and after 3 days, I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. So what great courage. She's putting her faith in God into action. And so after 3 days, we're in chapter 5 now. After 3 days, she put on her royal robes and she goes and stands in the inner court of the palace, probably just inside the door where King Xerxes can see her. And the king saw her, and he was sitting there on his throne. And when he saw Esther, the scripture says he was pleased with her, and he held out the gold scepter that was in his hand. And she approached him. Now, people didn't come into the throne room without something to ask of the king. That's why he held court. And so he knew she was there to make a request. And so he says, what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. Esther is obviously his favorite. And so she's being cagey. Esther knows it is not enough just to shut this down. She's got to deal with Haman. This is a very, very, not only is she beautiful, she's extremely wise. And so she's putting things in place. And she said to the king, come together with Haman today to a banquet I have prepared. And so the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther prepared. And as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, what is your petition? What do you wish to ask of me? And so she said, because she's still putting things in order. You know, it's one thing to have a plan. It's another thing entirely to execute it to perfection. And so not only has Esther concocted this plan, she's carrying it out with precision. And so when he asked her what she wanted, she said, if the king regards me with favor, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Oh, she's setting Haman up. She is setting him up to fall on his own ego and on his own plot. Now, Haman goes home. He's happy. He thinks he is rising up in the ranks, and he's becoming more and more important. And not only is the king showing him favor by promoting him, Esther's showing him favor by inviting him to not one but two banquets. And so that night he goes home and he called together all his friends and his wife, whose name was Zeresh. And he boasted to them about all the wealth that he had accumulated, all the sons that he had, and all the ways that the king was honoring him. And that's not all, he said. I'm the only one Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But then he changed. But all this gives me no satisfaction. As long as I see that Mordecai, I can almost see Seinfeld when he used to say, Newman. You know, he had that arch enemy, Newman. And that's the dynamic going on here. Haman hates Mordecai. And so he says, I can't even be happy knowing that Mordecai is sitting out there at the king's gate. And so his wife says to him, hey, why don't you have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits? That's 75 feet, folks. And ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Oh, Haman was delighted. He loved this plan. And so that night, though, and again, here's providence in action. Remember, we said earlier, God's providence was in action when Mordecai was in the right place to sniff out the assassination plot and save the king's life. Well, here's providence again. And this is in chapter 6. That night, this is the night after the first banquet. The second banquet is tomorrow. And that night, the king could not sleep. And so he ordered the book of the Chronicles. Now, this is not the books of Chronicles that we just studied. Those are the records of the kings of Israel and Judah. This is the record of the king of Persia. This is Xerxes' record. But they kept records just like all the other kingdoms. And so they brought this record to him of his reign, and somebody sat there and read it to him. And as they were reading, the section about Mordecai was found. I'll read what it says. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, who had conspired to assassinate the king. Well, Xerxes, that he perked up for that. He said, well, what did we do for Mordecai? What honor and recognition did he receive for this? And his attendants replied, nothing. Nothing has been done for him. Now, here's where the knife starts twisting a little more. Haman has just come in to the palace in order to ask King Xerxes for permission to erect this 75-foot pole in order to impale Mordecai on it. He doesn't need permission to build the pole, but he needs permission to execute Mordecai on it. And so he has just come in. King Xerxes looks up and says, oh, Haman, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now, Haman, because his ego has run amok, assumes the king is talking about him. What should be done for you, Haman, somebody that I want to honor? What should I do? And so Haman thought to himself, and it says, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse throughout the city streets. And then the first shoe drops. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew. I love that twist. And this is only the first shoe dropping. Haman bolts out of the throne room. This is in chapter 6. And he runs pretty much, I guess, all the way home. And he tells his wife and the friends that were gathered there what had happened. And they're listening to him tell this, in his opinion, awful turn of events. And while they were talking with him, the king's men arrived. And they hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. And so apparently he moaned and groaned and whined all night. And the next day, the king's attendants came to get him and take him to the banquet that Queen Esther had prepared for him and the king. Now, the other shoe drops. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. This is in chapter 7. And the king again asked Esther, what do you ask of me? What is your petition? Queen Esther answered, I and my people have been sold to be destroyed and annihilated. King Xerxes asked, well, who's doing this? Who is this person? Who has dared to do such a thing? You see, we find out something about Xerxes there. He doesn't give a rip that Esther is a Jew. She's just laid it out there for him, and he doesn't care. This is a man who cares deeply for Esther. And so when he says, who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, Haman, this vile Haman, she said. Now the king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. He's trying to walk it off. He's trying to maintain his composure. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned, Haman was falling on the couch, deeply emotional, bowing before Esther, and it didn't look good. He was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. And Xerxes took one look at that, and he called in the guards. They covered Haman's face in a hood, I assume. Then Harbona, one of the men attending the king said, "Hey, king, look out there in the side yard. There's a pole there that's 50 cubits tall. Stands right there by Haman's house, right down the street here. He had it set up for Mordecai." And the king didn't give it another thought. He said, "Impale him on it." And so they did. And that is the end of Haman. But we still have a major issue to resolve, because the king has issued an edict for the extermination of the Jewish people, and the king's edicts cannot be revoked. So even though there at the beginning of chapter 8, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther Haman's estate, and he elevated Mordecai to come into his court, and he took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So those two are doing really well, but they still have this problem that there is an edict issued to kill all the Jewish people, and that includes Esther and Mordecai. And so she pleaded with the king, and again, he extended his gold scepter toward her, showing his favor. And he said, here's what we're going to do. He had Mordecai write a new edict. He didn't revoke the old one, but with this new edict, and it was sent throughout all the kingdom, and he gave the Jewish people the right to defend themselves. It says the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy and kill the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them, and to plunder the property of their enemies. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was great rejoicing on the part of the Jewish people, because as exiles living there, they would not have been allowed to defend themselves. Now, here's where we come across something interesting. You may have heard of the Jewish feast of Purim. It's spelled P-U-R-I-M, and some of us Gentiles say Purim. Don't do that. If you say Purim to a Jewish person, they're going to laugh at you. It's Purim. And so on the 13th day of the 12th month, this is chapter 9, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. So on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is in their calendar was called Adar, the enemies of the Jews were hoping to overpower them, because that is the day that had been chosen to do the dirty deed. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews. And so they were spared. They struck down all their enemies, and the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves. And so all of this took place, and it says there, this happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th. And they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested. So you've got days of rest on both the 14th and 15th. And that's why modern Jews to this day still celebrate the Feast of Purim in late winter or early spring, with 2 days in which they read this book of Esther. They do it in the evening on both days. They give monetary gifts to at least 2 poor people. They send gifts of 2 kinds of food to at least 1 person, and they have a huge Purim feast, which includes a specific menu as well as a whole bunch of wine and intoxicating beverages. And so that's why the Jewish people have Purim. It is celebrating the days in which God spared the Jewish people who were still living in the Persian Empire under King Xerxes. And it's still celebrated today. We close up with Mordecai the Jew. He was elevated, as we said. He was preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem because he worked for the good of his people and spoke for the welfare of all. Now, here's what's happening. We have now covered Genesis through Esther. We've not done a very in-depth job. Remember, we're looking for threads, but we've made our way from Genesis all the way through Esther. And this is, in fact, the conclusion of the history in the Old Testament. Now, we're going to see other historical events talked about in the writings of the prophets. However, the history ends here after the accounts of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Why the rest of the history leading up to the final destruction of the nation of Israel or of Judah, it was not included. Maybe the books were lost. Maybe no one wrote it down. But the rest of the Old Testament is poetry, and the prophecies that are there were written during the time that we have just covered. Roughly 500 years is going to pass between that return to Judah and the beginning of the New Testament. This includes what's known as a period of silence, which is approximately 400 years leading up to the birth of Christ, in which it appeared God did not speak. There were no prophets. There were no books written to be included. And so we come to the end of that, and here's our plan for the remainder. We're going to go through the end of May. We're going to have a Wednesday night live stream each Wednesday night during May, and we're going to now cover the poetic books: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon. We're going to look at those, and we're going to save the prophetic books until the fall. However, when we get to the prophetic books, we'll have this foundation of history, and we'll be able to take each of the prophets and put them in the history that we now know. So for next week, read the book of Job. Try to be in a good mood before you do. And read the account of Job's life. The last page of this week's study guide, the Esther study guide, contains a chart that I think you might find helpful, useful. It is a little nutshell overview of the history that we've covered so far. So be sure you see that chart. Be sure to pick up the study notes and go through them. God bless you guys. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight. I hope it's been beneficial, and hope to see you all Sunday. Looking forward to it.